It's 6:45 a.m. on the 22nd of May, 1915. Aboard a troop train are 500 soldiers of the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots, traveling from Larbert, Scotland to Liverpool in England. These troops are preparing themselves for battle as they are heading to Gallipoli, Turkey, to help their fellow soldiers in the war effort against the Ottoman Empire. They are still cheerful and optimistic while approaching Gretna, a small town of 3,000 people near the border between Scotland and England, when suddenly everything starts to shake, followed by an ear-deafening sound. Without any time to realize what is happening, the soldiers get thrown in every direction as the troop train collides at full speed with a stationary local passenger train. A few seconds after the collision, some surviving soldiers are starting to regain their consciousness, but they are not prepared for what is yet to come. Earlier that morning around 6 a.m. at the Quintinshill signal box just north of Gretna, Mr. Meakin, the designated signalman, was wrapping up his shift. This signal box is responsible for regulating the train traffic passing through this double-track section, consisting of 2 main tracks and 2 passing loops, which are used for overtaking or the parking of trains. With northbound trains going from Carlisle, England to Glasgow, Scotland, traveling on the so-called down main line, and southbound trains going from Scotland to England, traveling on the up main line. At the end of the up main line lies Gretna Station, and on the opposite side lies the next signal box called Kirkpatrick. While waiting on his colleague Mr. Tinsley to relieve him from his shift around 6:30 a.m., Mr. Meakin is still busy resolving some train traffic on this section. Earlier, he helped park a fight train on the down loop to free the other 3 tracks for passing trains. Finally, the local passenger train arrives on the down main line, carrying Mr. Tinley on board, ready to start his shift. Following the rail company's policy, Mr. Tinley should have started his shift half an hour earlier, but the 2 signalmen had an under-the-table agreement where the night shift signalman would work half an hour later so that Mr. Tinsley could catch the local train to work. The night shift signalman would then record train entries between 6 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. on a separate piece of paper, which Mr. Tinsley would copy in the official register himself. In this way, the record starting from 6 a.m. would be in Mr. Tinsley's handwriting, and nobody would notice the later start. Mr. Tinsley has left his train and is now walking towards the signal box to start his shift. Mr. Meakin, in the meantime, is redirecting the local train from the down main line to be parked on the up main line to make way for an upcoming northbound sleeper express coming from Carlisle. On the same track, an empty coal train is still waiting to be parked, preventing Meakin from sending the train out of section signal to Kirkpatrick, which means that a track is free. Once the local passenger train was on the up main line, Meakin allowed the empty coal train to pass through to the up loop. At 6:34 a.m., one of the 2 signalmen sent the train out of section bell to Kirkpatrick, forgetting to send a blocking back signal which was meant to inform the signal box of the local train parked on the up main line, breaching the most crucial rule. Finally, Mr. Tinsley arrives at the Quintinshill signal box, and Mr. Meakin is relieved from his shift. Immediately, Mr. Tinsley starts copying the notes left by Mr. Meakin, and Mr. Meakin decides to hang around for a while and start reading his morning paper. You see, there were rules set by the railway department to avoid train accidents or unwanted traffic on railways. One of which was Rule 55, which stated that if a train was parked for longer than 3 minutes on one of the main lines, the train fireman had to inform the train guard of the parked train. The fireman was required to sign the train register to confirm that he had visited the signal box and had fulfilled his responsibility. Following the rules, the driver of the local train sent his fireman to Mr. Tinsley to inform him about the parked local train. Mr. Tinsley, who was still busy copying his entries, handed him the pen to register the train's arrival time in the logbook without even looking over his shoulder. The fireman, named Mr. Hutchinson, follows this silent command, enters the time, and walks out of Quintinshill at 6:45 a.m. But he forgets one small detail, a piece of information so tiny yet crucial enough to decide the fate of hundreds of men. Mr. Hutchinson forgot to word it out. "The train is parked on the up main line, Mr. Tinsley," a sentence that never left his mouth to reach Mr. Tinsley's ears. A few minutes earlier, at 6:38 a.m., a northbound sleeper express train passed through Quintinshill on the down main line. while the 5 men in the signal box, including Mr. Tinsley, watched. Not long after, the signal box at Kirkpatrick sends a signal to Quintinshill, informing them of the arrival of a troop train that will head to the south. Amidst the wartime, this was more of a command than really a question of, is it possible? So without any hesitation, Mr. Tinsley accepts the troop train and informs the receiving signal box at the Gretna station of the approaching train. The message is immediately accepted without inquiry. Now, all 3 signal boxes are in agreement, so Mr. Tinsley opens the tracks for the troop train to pass through the Quintinshill. After fulfilling his duty, Mr. Tinsley returned to his conversation with the other man present in the signal box. It is 6:45, and just as the fireman of the local train leaves the signal box, the troop train approaches Quintinshill at full speed, ready to pass through. The fireman closes the door of the signal box and starts walking toward the local train. Suddenly, he hears the troop train approaching from the north. As he looks up, his whole body freezes as he sees the horror unfold. At 6:49 a.m., the troop train crashes head-on into the local train on the up main line. The wooden carriages in the front get obliterated, leaving little chance for survival. Watching in horror, Mr. Tinsley rushes out to change the approach signal on the down main line to red to stop other trains from approaching the platform, but he's too late. The sleeper train is already approaching the scene at full speed. The only thing he can do now is watch the devastating second crash unfold. The sleeper train crashes into the wreckage of the other 2 trains, taking away all hope of people coming out alive from the first crash. The impact is so strong that it propels parts of the wreckage into a parked freight train near Quintinshill, making it a 4-train collision. However, the tragedy is not over yet. Mr. Tinkley, still shocked from what he just witnessed, realizing that the troop train has gas reservoirs on board that can explode any second now. The reservoirs were ruptured, allowing contact of the escaping gas with the locomotive's fireboxes. Soon, an earth-shattering explosion ensues, causing a massive fire that destroys even the fragments of the 4 trains. The first outsiders to come to the rescue of the victims were the Dunbar couple, who lived near the railway tracks and were interviewed after the shocking incident. Mrs. Dunbar recalled herself believing a bomb had dropped nearby, and that the Germans had arrived in Scotland. Shocking stories of what happened during the rescue of the soldiers reached mainstream media. One survivor interviewed by the BBC reported, "Many of them had amputations carried out underneath burning carriages so that they could be rescued. But many, of course, were trapped in such a position that they couldn't be gotten out, or else the fire had taken hold, and they couldn't be got to. And of course, since then, we've heard stories of some soldiers being shot, and some soldiers possibly taking their own lives. It's never been formally documented. My own personal belief is that it probably did happen, in a sense of compassion, of mercy killing. It's almost impossible sitting here to comprehend what it was like that morning. Around 226 people died that day, and 246 were injured, most of which were part of the Royal Scots, which was the most senior infantry regiment of the British Army. The surviving men shared horrific accounts of the brutality with which they were rescued, and how many soldiers died of mercy killings, making the collision the worst disaster in the history of Great Britain. But before the last of the soldiers could be evacuated from the ruins, a special investigation team was sent in to uncover details that would shock the entire nation of Great Britain. This is how the Quintinshill disaster exposed the corruption within the railway department. In 1915, during the First World War, railway companies were mostly privately owned enterprises. Independent of the government, these railway companies had a business-as-usual attitude even during the times of war, when groups of soldiers used trains as a means of transportation to their base. The Caledonian Railway put all blame on the 2 signalmen present in the Quintinshill signal room. The official report released to the public stated that the full responsibility of 200 men killed in the tragedy entirely fell on Mr. Tinsley and his forgetfulness. However, the report could not go into the details of the 8 rules broken that day. The most notable of them was the under-the-table agreements between the signalmen, so the day shift signalmen could start 30 minutes later. The presence of unauthorized persons in the signal box also created a distraction for the signalmen. Mr. Tinsley's grave forgetfulness of the stationary train present on the up main line resulted in him permitting the troop train to pass through the same track, which eventually led to a horrific tragedy. However, as the book The Quintinshill Conspiracy suggests, the truth was far more complex than reported by the Caledonian Railway's heavily biased statements. The layout of the signal box had the levers in operations with their backs to the railway. It simply wasn't practical nor expected of Mr. Tinsley to be constantly looking out of the window. The railway company was also later criticized that Quintinshill wasn't equipped with electrical interlocking of the signals, which would have prevented Mr. Tinsley from allowing the troop train to approach, as it would have detected the stopped local train. Such systems were in the process of widespread installation, but its simple layout and good visibility had given Quintinshill low priority regarding the upgrade. At no point was this ever brought up in the investigation and trial. Even the prosecutor of the case seemed to have very little knowledge of railway workings. If this wasn't enough, eyewitness accounts describe Mr. Tinsley's epilepsy as constant and recurring, leaving him in a state of panic after the first crash, unable to comprehend the intensity of the disaster. Even after all this evidence was found by local news reporters, the three men, Tinsley, Hutchinson, and Meakin, were all prosecuted on the 24th of September, 1915. Only Tinsley and Meakin were found guilty of culpable homicide. The jury found that if the two of them had obeyed either one of the rules of 1. Blocking back, 2. Lever collars, or 3. An orderly train register, the lives could have been saved. Tinsley was granted release after a little over a year. After his time in prison, he would come back straight to work as a lampman at Caledonian Railway. Meakin also returned to the railway as a goods train guard. Some years later, he was fired from that job and set himself up as a coal merchant, trading from Quintinshill siding, right next to the scene of the crash. In 2015, the BBC re-examined the disaster from a modern perspective. It argued that both signalmen had been made scapegoats for the crashes and found fault with both the railway company and the government, who ran the railway in wartime. Going further, citing the fact both men returned to work after their sentences, it postulated there had been some conspiracy between the company and the men to take sole blame for the accident. Some victims of the disaster were never found, and those who were found were buried together in Edinburgh's Rosebank Cemetery. The survivors were taken to the hospital to examine if they were medically fit for service. All of them were declared unfit and returned back to Edinburgh. It was reported by the local newspaper that some survivors were mistaken for prisoners of war, resulting in children throwing stones at them. To watch more train disasters, subscribe to this channel. Your support keeps me motivated to research more on these topics.